Welcome to the first lecture of Unit 2. And in this unit, we're going to look at the colonies in North America and the European colonies that were actually successful in North America. And we're going to see how were they successful and how did these colonial ventures actually change the history of North America. So to start, we're going to take a look at three colonies today, that of Plymouth, of Jamestown, and then also of Quebec. And so to begin, as always, we will start with our goals of the class. And our goals of the class today are to first explain why and how the English were able to expand their colonies on North America. Second, explain the differences between English and French colonialism or colonization. Third, be able to define settler colonialism and distinguish it from other types of colonialisms. And then lastly, identify how Algonquins, both the Powhatan Confederacy and Wampanoags, Pequots, and Narragansetts, resisted English colonialism. So with that said, let's go ahead and begin. So first I want to review the different colonial patterns that the Spanish, the French, and the English had with their colonies in North America, because they effectively have three very different strategies for establishing successful colonies in the continent. Now, we already have gone over the Spanish and discussed Spanish rule in Hispaniola, and also discussed the Spanish taking over of the Aztec Empire in modern-day central Mexico. So the Spanish pattern involved taking over the position of indigenous leaderships. They would find an indigenous nation and conquer that nation and take control of that nation and effectively govern it using those same sort of indigenous political structures. And that's what the Spanish did with the Aztec Empire. They take Tenochtitlan, they govern the Aztec Empire effectively from the palaces of Tenochtitlan. And this sort of colonial strategy is city-based. So the Spanish will kind of hold up in larger indigenous cities and then try to exert their power outside of the cities that they take over. And then they will lastly focus on resource extraction. So they're trying to get precious minerals, especially gold and silver. And in fact, the Spanish set up actually some silver mines in northern Mexico. And they also use indigenous labor to extract these resources. So the Spanish rule over a largely indigenous population. Now, the French work in quite a different way. The French seek to cultivate alliances with local indigenous peoples, and then also embed French traders in indigenous communities so that they can establish relationships with indigenous peoples, and then use those relationships to then get specifically furs from these communities, and then extract these furs and sell them in Europe for a profit. And so this is what the French do in Quebec. They establish Quebec City and a few other smaller villages on the St. Lawrence River, and then they seek to use a variety of alliances with Algonquin peoples to bring these furs into Quebec and then sell them in Europe for a big profit. And so this sort of types of colonialism is more alliance based and is more based on direct trade. Now the English have a very different sort of view. The English attempt to acquire land from indigenous peoples and then remove indigenous peoples from that land. And so, unlike the Spanish, the English often do not use native peoples as labor. There are a few exceptions to that. We'll talk about the case of New England, which is actually quite different. But the goal is to acquire the land, not necessarily like precious metals or not necessarily trade goods, but take land and then grow food on this land, or grow cash crops and make money off these cash crops. But it all forms of sort of English colonialism are used to take land from indigenous peoples and then remove indigenous peoples from this land. And this is the basis of what we would call to be settler colonialism. And we'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. So I'm going to begin today looking at the history of Jamestown. Now, Jamestown was established in 1607, and it was established by the Virginia Company, which was a company that received a charter for this colony from the English king, or essentially permission to go out and establish a colony in modern day Virginia. And they established a settlement on the edge of the James River, which is this large river in modern day eastern Virginia. And the site they established it on was actually a wetlands and marshy area that had actually pretty poor soil. It was a site that the local Powhatan Confederacy did not inhabit because it was a pretty useless site. You couldn't grow much there. It was a very boggy, kind of marshy place. And there were actually a lot of mosquitoes there as well, which spread disease. So the English colonists chose a very poor site to establish this town, and they struggled to grow their own food in this poor soil, and they also came and established the settlement far too late in the season to properly grow their own food as well. And the colonists sort of expected to just be able to arrive and make a lot of money off of mining and finding gold and silver, and they didn't really plan therefore their food supply. They assumed they'd just trade with the local Native American groups for their food, or be supplied by England. And so there weren't a lot of people who actually understood the difficulty in setting up a colony here. And so the initial site of Jamestown actually had a lot of issues and a lot of problems for the population. And one of the most prominent colonists of this initial settlement of Jamestown was John Smith. And John Smith conducted the initial scouting of the area and made contact with the local Powhatan Confederacy, who actually captured him. And John Smith, at least he writes in his diary or his letters, that he very much feared for his life because he thought that the Powhatans were going to kill him. And suddenly, this little girl by the name of Pocahontas came and put herself in between John Smith and the adults, and supposedly saved his life, and she convinced the adults not to kill him. Many historians actually think that this might have been either invented by John Smith and completely made up by him, or that this was actually a Algonquin adoption ritual, where they essentially, the local Powhatans sort of scare John Smith to think that they're going to kill him, but actually create a sort of familial relationship as Powhatan himself adopts John Smith as his adopts, and kind of quotation marks, as his son, basically. So this John Smith's able to create an initial sort of trading relationship with the Powhatan Confederacy so that Jamestown can supply itself. But John Smith's in an accident, and he ends up kind of going back to London to recuperate. And when this happens, eventually there's tensions between the English and the Powhatans, and there's some fighting, and the Powhatan Confederacy just cuts off all trade with Jamestown, and this leaves Jamestown in a dire situation because they're living in the settlement with poor soil. They can't really grow their own food, and they don't really know how to. They're drinking water that's very brackish and actually causes a lot of disease, as they don't properly take care of the water supply and they contaminate it, and actually end up suffering from diseases like dysentery. And as well, they're living in an area with lots of mosquitoes, and so there's also mosquito-borne diseases that are weakening the community. And in the winter of 1609, Jamestown actually goes through a massive famine, and out of the 500 people in Jamestown, only around 90 or so end up surviving, with even reports of cannibalism. Nonetheless, those 90 people do survive. John Smith returns with other settlers, and England keeps sending settlers to Jamestown. And John Smith as well implements some sort of kind of like a military code in Jamestown and forces the population to start working and farming and plowing the land. And they move the site of Jamestown to a better location with arable land. And they're able to suddenly start growing their own food. And they become a little bit more self-sufficient. And this is when the Powhatan Confederacy starts seeing Jamestown less as this sort of disease-ridden, sad, pathetic little settlement over there, and something more of a threat to their control of this Senecobica, which is what the Powhatan Confederacy called this land. And it's at this time that an outbreak of wars starts between the English and the Powhatan Confederacy that will last for many decades. And there is sort of multiple tensions that begin to develop between settlers and the Powhatan Confederacy. In particular, there's a notorious massacre where a group of English soldiers come across this native village, Paspahegh, and they actually kill dozens of people, including women and children. And Pocahontas herself is actually captured during this war by the English. And eventually, both sides kind of come to the negotiating table, and the Powhatan Confederacy and the English sit down and agree to peace talks. And as part of these peace talks, Powhatan marries off his daughter, Pocahontas, to a man by the name of John Rolfe. And this is actually a diplomatic marriage that is meant to sort of settle these conflicts between the Powhatan Confederacy and the English. Now, Pocahontas herself actually, historians think, sees herself as a diplomat and in a diplomatic marriage with John Rolfe. And her purpose is to sort of preserve peace between the Powhatan Confederacy and the English, and also learn more about the English. And so she actually travels to London with her husband, John Rolfe. She's painted here in English clothing and wears English clothing, and actually visits many dignitaries in England when she's there. And she actually meets John Smith in England, and has a personal feud with John Smith because of John Smith's recent sort of involvement with the war between the English and Powhatan Confederacy. And she almost sees that like John Smith sort of betrayed his word that he would be a friend to the Powhatan Confederacy. And tragically, Pocahontas, or Mataoka, which was her name as an adult, ends up dying of a sort of unknown disease. It could have been a variety of different diseases in England, and she dies at a fairly young age, at the age of around 20 or 21, quite tragically. But Pocahontas isn't just sort of an individual with this sort of silly story saving John Smith's life, from her father, but it's actually a very important individual and a very important diplomat for the Powhatan Confederacy. And again, historians think that she saw herself as a diplomat to the English. Now, despite the diplomatic marriage between John Rolfe and Pocahontas, A number of changes happen in both the Powhatan Confederacy and Virginia that leads to renewed tensions between the two entities. So, first in the Powhatan Confederacy, um, Powhatan himself dies, and his younger brother takes over leadership of the Powhatan Confederacy, and his younger brother's name is Apinchon. And Apinchon has a more sort of aggressive policy against the English for a variety of different reasons. One of which is that the English begin engaging in Christianization of local Algonquin peoples, and they begin spreading Christianity. And English settlers also begin moving into Powhatan lands. And they start moving their domesticated animals, including like cattle and pigs, into Powhatan lands as well. And this actually really bothers and annoys a lot of the Algonquin people who live nearby. Nonetheless, there's still a lot of peaceful interactions between the Powhatan people and the English, and there's sort of regularized trade and interactions between both groups of people. And so it becomes very common for local Algonquins to come into the English town, buy a few goods, and go back to their home village, and for the English to do the same. And what this leads to is sort of an opportunity for Chankanoag to surprise the English in a sort of mass attack. And so Chankanoag organizes many different Algonquin villages and organizes a mass uprising against the English. Um, and this this mass surprise attack on English towns actually kills one-third of the English population overnight. Um, and Apinchakanoag thinks the message that this is sending is that the English shouldn't move into Powhatan lands. That you need to stay near the coast, stay away from us, stop stealing our lands. But the English look at this and say, we just lost a third of our population. This in fact proves that we cannot live near the Powhatan Confederacy. They will engage in quote unquote barbarous actions against us. And the English sort of conclude from this that they have to engage in a mass conflict against the Powhatan Confederacy. And so two very different sort of conclusions come from this mass surprise attack of Pinchonkanowag, which leads to actually a 10-year brutal conflict between the Powhatan Confederacy and the English. So the war between the Powhatan Confederacy and the English stem from a variety of different practices that the English adopt. So first, this colony keeps growing and keeps growing pretty rapidly, and that's because thousands of people are coming from England to gain access to their own land in Virginia, and they're spreading out and they're constantly taking land from the Powhatan Confederacy. The other thing that they're doing is they're engaging in cultivation of sweet tobacco. And sweet tobacco is actually brought by John Rolfe, the husband of Pocahontas, from Brazil and is cultivated in Virginia. And tobacco actually very much uses up the soil. And so what tobacco farmers would do is they'd grow tobacco on land and then very quickly try to get new land to grow more tobacco on it because it uses up the soil so rapidly. And tobacco is effectively a cash crop, and so it's exported in huge quantities back to England, where it's used as sort of a drug, and it's used, and these tobacco farmers can gain incredible wealth. And so what this leads is a strong financial incentive to constantly gain more and more territory to grow more tobacco. And this also leads to the introduction of slavery in Virginia, because you need people to work this land. And so Virginia, the colony of Virginia, begins buying enslaved peoples from the west coast of Africa, and bringing people here to work the land. Um, and and this creates an incredibly unequal society where you have a small group of incredibly rich tobacco farmers being supported by enslaved peoples who have a very short lifespan in Virginia due to a significant amount of disease in this sort of marshy territory. Um, and so you have this unequal society growing rapidly due to immigration, um, that is constantly seeking more and more land from the Powhatan Confederacy. And this leads to these tensions that lead to this huge conflict between the Powhatan Confederacy and the English. And this again leads to this third Anglo-Powhatan War, which is quite a brutal war. Um, and the other Algonquin peoples ally with the Powhatan Confederacy to fight the English. But the English, with their sort of increased demographics, are able to push the Powhatan Confederacy back, and fight fight the Powhatan Confederacy quite successfully. And in this war, there's a lot of sort of brutal massacres back and forth, and the English especially will come into Powhatan towns, and brutally murder most of the population. And so these are not sort the types of conflicts where two armies meet in a field. It is ambush attacks on civilians and the killing of civilians on a pretty regular basis. And the English and the Powhatan Confederacy in this war through this treaty called the Treaty of 1840 or 1646, which I had you read for this unit this week. And it's important to look into this treaty because it actually explains very clearly how sort of English settler colonialism works. So if we look at Article 3 here, it says that Necotowance and his people leave free that tract of land between the York River and the James River, from the falls of both rivers to Kecoughtan, for the English to inhabit on. So it's establishing a specific spot for the English to take from the Powhatan Confederacy. And that, quote, neither he, the said Necotowance, nor any Indians do repair to or make any abode upon the said tract of land, upon pain of death, and it shall be lawful for any person to kill any such Indian. So what they're specifically saying is, this used to be your land, but this is now our land, and if you even um, come onto this land for any reason, it is now lawful for the English to kill you, effectively. And this is this sort of key aspect of settler colonialism. The goal of these wars are to secure land, to grow crops, to then make a big profit, and to expel native peoples from this land. And so the English are, in fact, creating a colonial community that does not include Native Americans. And this is quite different than the French or the Spanish. The Spanish are ruling over native peoples. Native peoples are being used as labor by the Spanish. The French are often trading locally with native peoples, and alliances are sort of key for the French position. But the English in Virginia very clearly try to expel native peoples from their polity and say that this land is English land, and Native Americans cannot be a part of the local political system in the colony of Virginia. So, and this will set a sort of key pattern, not only for the English throughout Eastern North America, but also for the United States, that will adopt the same sort of view that often doesn't consider Native peoples as citizens of the United States. And we'll talk about that later on in this class. So, nonetheless, while the sort of English system separates English and Algonquin domains. Trade and interaction are still quite common, and even after the sort of 1846 treaty, the English still regularly trade with the Powhatan Confederacy and other native peoples. And the Algonquins still remain powerful and relevant in Senecomica. And despite practices of settler colonialism, the English do still recognize sovereignty of native polities. They still establish a treaty with native peoples, right? So they're still seeing them as a sovereign country that is separate from the English colony, and one that you have to engage in diplomacy with. So that's sort of a sort of still key part of settler colonialism in the 1600s. Now, the French set up a quite different colonial system. So the French began exploring through modern day Canada and modern day Quebec in northeastern Canada. And they went down the St. Lawrence River. And Samuel de Champlain actually sets up one of the first French settlements, which is Quebec City. And the French have a pretty small population on the St. Lawrence River, but they quickly make friends with different local indigenous groups, including the Hurons, which are an Iroquoian group to the west that lived around sort of modern day Toronto. And the Hurons, they began sort of a trading relationship with the French, and some even Jesuit French missionaries come and start creating local Christian communities. Sort of interweave both indigenous religious beliefs and a sort of belief in Catholicism. But the French find themselves sort of intermeshed very quickly in indigenous politics in the region, and find themselves allied not only with the Hurons but also with other Algonquin groups who for a long time had been fighting with the Haudenosaunee, or the Five Nations, which I briefly mentioned in a previous lecture in Unit 1. And the Haudenosaunee was actually much stronger than New France, and began a sort of series of raids against the settlements around Quebec City that are quite successful and constantly sort of result in French losses. And the French pretty consistently will lose about 5% of their population to Haudenosaunee raids over the course of the 1600s. And to make things worse, the Haudenosaunee also expand their sort of territory into the Algonquin allies of the French, and so the Haudenosaunee actually wipe out the Huron people and absorb other local peoples as well, like for instance the Erie Nation, which existed in modern day northeastern Ohio. And through these sort of constant wars against Algonquins in the sort of Great Lakes region, the Haudenosaunee pretty successfully start absorbing people into their nation and significantly growing their population. And so the French presence in Quebec City is sort of besieged by this growing threat of the Haudenosaunee, who become a very powerful entity in North America in the 1600s and 1700s. But the French are still able to survive and still able to be successful through the efforts of the Coureurs de Bois, who are independent fur traders who go out and embed themselves in local Algonquin communities in sort of modern day Illinois and in Anishinaabe communities in modern day northern Michigan and Minnesota as well. And they're able to sort of marry local indigenous Native Americans and set up trade links between Quebec and these different Algonquin communities, and bring furs out of these communities and sell them in Europe for a pretty good profit. So this is how the French are able to sort of sustain themselves in Canada, and do so quite successfully. Now, the English not only set up a colony in Jamestown in 1607, but also set up a colony in Plymouth in modern day Massachusetts in 1620. And this colony is, however, quite different from that of that of Jamestown. In Jamestown, set up by the Virginia Land Company, it's a secular colony that is seeking to profit, essentially. The colony at Plymouth is set up by a sort of minor religious sect called Puritans. And Puritans believe that they want to effectively quote unquote purify the Church of England, which separated from the Catholic Church in the 1500s, but for the most part kept a lot of the same rituals as the Catholic Church. And the Puritans want a much more sort of Protestant religion that gets rid of a lot of these sort of Catholic rites, like for instance the worship of saints, the worshiping of saints, and other sort of rituals. And the goal of the Puritans in coming to Plymouth and coming to the Western Hemisphere is to set up their own sort of godly community that is pure from the sort of taint of the Church of England. And many historians have talked about there's been this sort of historical myth that this was kind of they came here to exercise freedom of religion. And that's not exactly the case. They could have their puritanical views in England, and that wasn't really a problem. The problem is that they were surrounded by people who didn't believe the way they believed. And they wanted to set up their own community to force puritanical views on the community as a whole. And this gets into sort of more complicated sort of Christian theology that basically states that nowadays in Christianity, there's ideas of sort of individual salvation, right? A person will sort of go to heaven or hell based off their own beliefs and their own actions. In the 1600s, that was quite different. There was more of an idea of communal salvation. And so the Puritans believed if you were surrounded by people who were not worshiping properly, then they could be sort of condemned by that. They could be damned by that. So they needed to set up these sort of individual godly communities that were separate from the political system in England. And that was the reason to set up these places in Plymouth. And so they arrive in 1620, and they find at Plymouth, they find effectively an abandoned Wampanoag town. And the Wampanoags were a group of Native Americans who lived in modern day coastal Massachusetts. But there was a group of this particular town apparently was infected by smallpox and abandoned, and there are lots of it sort of very quickly killed a lot of the population there. And the sort of these very sort of fanatical Puritans show up in this abandoned Wampanoag town, and they're like, oh hey, look, God killed the Native Americans so we could live here, and they start living in abandoned Wampanoag village, and they in fact dig up corn that was planted by the Wampanoags the previous season, and they use that to live off of during the winter before they can sort of set up their own farms. And they get help from a local Algonquin named Tisquantum, who was actually previously captured and taken to England. and was from the village of Patuxent. And he actually sort of teaches them how to farm in the soil, and teaches them how to grow maize and beans and squash in the way that Wampanoags do. Um, and this actually helps the English set up their own food supply there. Um, and uh, it's important to note that this group of Puritans is actually quite differently socially from the English in Virginia as well. It's mostly middle class families um, who, and it's a pretty equal society. And their goal is not to farm cash crops, but as I was saying earlier, is to set up this sort of godly community with sort of independent farmers that grow their own food and live in a Puritan type of way. So the sort of Puritans are able to set up a fairly successful settlement at Plymouth. Um, and they begin to bring in domesticated animals, just like the Virginians did, cattle and pigs. And again, they sort of let these domesticated animals run wild, and these animals start tearing up the sort of farms of the local Wampanoag people who are living in villages quite nearby. And so while there are a couple of sort of peaceful feasts between the local Wampanoags and the Puritans, some of which sort of inspire the modern day holiday of Thanksgiving. For the most part, the bringing of these domesticated animals, the cutting down of nearby forests, leads to tensions between the local Wampanoag villages and the English, and leads to significant violence. So Plymouth Colony eventually merges with the colony of Massachusetts Bay, and this sort of unified colony um, engages in significant colonialism against local native populations, and seeks to expand Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they get involved in local native politics, like most colonial powers do. And they make an alliance with a local powerful political unit called the Narragansetts, who live live around modern day Rhode Island. And they actually, the Massachusetts Bay and the Narragansetts together attack a local group called the Pequots, living in modern day Connecticut. And the Narragansetts and Massachusetts Bay actually have significant disagreements over their objectives in this war. And so the Narragansett focus is on killing Pequot leaders. And they want to eliminate the Pequot leaders, and then actually take over the Pequots as sort of a tributary relationship. Incorporate Pequot civilians into small towns to grow sort of Narragansett power. Whereas the English actually support attacking Pequot civilians, and then engaging in mass enslavement of Pequots, not only to use Pequots as slaves within English villages, but also to sell enslaved Pequots to the Caribbean for a profit. And so there's a strong disagreement over the sort of aims of the war. And in particular, there's this one attack on a local Pequot settlement by the Narragansetts and the English that goes quite successfully. And at the end of this battle, the English go into the town and just start murdering men and boys. And the Narragansetts are shocked by this action. They actually protest against the English and say, what are you doing? We do not engage in this sort of mass warfare like you guys do. And the English take hundreds of women and children into slavery, and bring them into local English towns as sort of enslaved peoples to do domesticated work. And the Pequot population is pretty much eliminated by this war. But Pequots themselves continue to live and survive in English towns around Massachusetts Bay and around in Connecticut as well. And the Pequots actually bring in local native foods into English households because many of the English use Pequots as enslaved cooks to essentially cook meals, and also as enslaved farm labor or carpenters. And the Pequots actually, bring in for instance, the use of pumpkins, the use of turkey, the use of sort of native foods, and the new cornmeal. Native foods become sort of a staple in New England diets through the enslavement of Pequot people, and they continue to exist in New England society. And the Pequot Nation today still exists. And the English use a variety of different strategies to get a hold of native land in New England, and not just that of warfare, but also that of a sort of coercive legal system. And so I want to bring up this one particular case, that of the case of Saconet, which is this land right here at the south of this map. You can see. And it's near sort of modern day sort of eastern Rhode Island or western Massachusetts. And the English actually engage in negotiations with this guy named Mamunua, who claims the title of Sachem of Saconet. And Sachem is sort of a title for a leader of a specific region. And Saconet was a Wampanoag polity, set of Wampanoag villages in this area. And Mamunua was actually educated at Cambridge, knew English, and was using this sort of claim to be this leader of this community to actually make money off of selling native land. And so he actually goes to English and says, "Oh yeah, I'm happy to sell my land that I own as a male member of Saconet, and sign this treaty with me, and you English settlers can move into the territory I own." Of course, that's not how land ownership actually works in Wampanoag society. In Wampanoag society, the women actually own the land, and so Mamunua sells out his community, and the women of Saconet attempt to resist his sort of claims and say, no, we own this land. But through this sort of faulty treaty and this faulty land sale, the English are able to essentially steal the land of Saconet and use Mamunua's claim as a legal shield to these lands. And it's through a lot of these sort of using sort of unscrupulous individuals within Wampanoag communities that the English are able to use the legal system to acquire land in New England. And this sort of activity will eventually prompt resistance among native peoples, who will engage in sort of a military struggle to retake this territory that the English have effectively swindled from them in local English courts. And so this will sort of conclude our look at English and French colonies in North America in the early 1600s. But it's through these sorts of methods of settler colonialism that the English are able to establish themselves, both in modern-day New England and in Virginia, and create two societies that are actually quite different from one another, right? Virginia is more of this hierarchical society. New England is more of this equal sort of independent society of independent farmers and sort of religious radicals. Um, However, both of them have very similar relationships with Native Americans, and that both engage in significant amounts of settler colonialism, where they seek to take the land of Native peoples and expel Native peoples from this land. And meanwhile, the French sort of engage in a very different type of colonialism that based more on alliances and trade, while still engaging in significant wars, for instance, against the Haudenosaunee. And so it's in the early 1600s, the Europeans are able to establish these sorts of footholds on the North American continent. But Native peoples are still very important in this colonial world and will actually resist pretty significantly in the late 1600s. And so, for our next lecture, we're going to talk about the sort of Great Revolt of the late 1600s and what happens in both New England and Virginia and out west in modern day New Mexico. So, thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.